The soil moved. That was the first thing Kale noticed, and she almost didn't notice it at all. 3 years on Verdana Station's night rotation had a way of sanding down a person's sharper instincts. You stopped seeing things. You started surviving hours instead of living them. So when the topsoil in Crate 7 shifted, a soft, barely there tremor like something breathing underneath, she almost filed it under the general category of things she'd deal with tomorrow, clocked out, and let it become someone else's problem. She didn't. Cale Morrow, senior botanist, Verdana Agricultural Compound, Greenhouse Ring 7, pressed her palm flat against the container's rusted lip and held still. The crate was one of 14 that had arrived on the evening freight haul from Sector Dusk. An unscheduled delivery. No manifest, no origin stamp beyond a smeared corporate glyph she didn't recognize. She'd flagged it to the duty officer twice. Both times she'd been told to sit on it until morning. So she sat, she worked. She watered her bean plants and pruned the fungal rot from the tomato vines, and listened to the playlist she'd compiled over 8 months of nights. A loose thread of old songs that reminded her the universe had once contained things other than fluorescent light and potting soil. The crate didn't move again. Cale straightened. She rolled her shoulders. She looked at the dog. Her name was Cass. Canine Autonomous Security Sentinel, designation 7G, property of Helix Corp Agricultural Division. But everyone called her Scout. And Scout was sitting very, very still 3 meters from Crate 7, head lowered, ears flat, the low amber of her optical sensors fixed on the container with an intensity that Cale had never seen in the animal before. Scout had been posted to the greenhouse 6 months ago, when a rash of equipment thefts had spooked the company into installing visible deterrents. She was a sleek, dark-coated synthetic. A Doberman frame, Cale had always thought, though she'd never asked the manufacturer, and she was generally about as threatening as a lamp. She'd learned to play fetch. She responded to her name. She'd once carried a tomato stake across the greenhouse for no reason Cale could understand, simply dropping it at Cale's feet and staring up at her with those warm amber lights, expectant and oddly hopeful. She was not doing any of that now. Scout, Cale said. Hey, the dog didn't move. Cale crossed to the intercom panel mounted beside the east airlock and hit the call button for the main compound. Static, then a tired voice. Brennan, the overnight security coordinator, 3 years from retirement and already mentally somewhere warm. Greenhouse 7. What is it, Morrow? That unscheduled delivery, she said. 14 soil crates from Sector Dusk. I'm logging a possible containment issue. A pause. The sound of something being set down. Define possible. My biosensor dog is treating Crate 7 like it's the last thing she ever wants to look at. Another pause, longer. Morrow. Scout is a 2-year-old synthetic who last week spent 40 minutes barking at her own reflection in the nitrogen tank. Yeah, Cale said. And she's also never once in 6 months reacted to a plant crate. Silence on the line. She could hear Brennan breathing. She could hear behind that the distant hum of the compound's ventilation system, the same hum she'd been hearing for 3 years. So constant it had become part of her internal architecture. And then she heard something else. It was quiet, small. A sound like dry paper folding, or the legs of something hard and jointed flexing inside a confined space. It came from Crate 7. Brennan, she said quietly. I'm initiating containment protocol. Morrow, you don't have the authority to. She hit the button. The greenhouse went red. The overhead lights shifted from white to deep amber emergency wash. The external airlocks sealed with a mechanical thunk that echoed through the vaulted ceiling. A sound like a coffin lid. And somewhere above her the ventilation system whirred into reverse. Positive pressure out, negative pressure in. Standard biohazard containment. They drilled it twice a year. She'd always thought drills were a kind of theater, a shared performance of seriousness that no one expected to ever matter. Her earpiece crackled. Override rejected, Morrow. You don't have. She pulled the earpiece out. The greenhouse at night was a long vaulted space, 200 meters end to end. The ceiling arching 20 meters overhead, framed with aluminum ribs from which grow lights hung in ranked rows. Between those rows the plants rose, beanstalks and soy pillars, and broad-leafed experimental cultivars that rustled gently in the circulated air, forming corridors and shadows and green walls that the amber emergency light turned the color of old copper. It was beautiful in a way that Cale had stopped noticing a long time ago. She was noticing it now. She picked up the nearest tool. A square-bladed spade, worn handle, the blade edge still carrying dried soil from the morning's work. She held it the way her grandfather had held a fence post, two-handed, low, like the weight of the thing was the point. Scout was still watching crate 7. Then the crate moved. Not a tremor, a heave. The rusted lid shifting upward 3 centimeters, held by its own latch, but straining against something that pushed from inside with a patient, sustained pressure that had nothing biological about it. Nothing that ate, breathed, slept, or dreamed. Just pressure. Just the slow, implacable intention of a thing that had been waiting. Okay, Kale said to herself. To nobody. To the empty greenhouse and the amber dark and the quiet that had replaced her playlist. Okay. She'd read the colony briefings. Everyone had. You got them in orientation, 20 pages of dense corporate language that all translated to. There are things in the outer sectors that we have not yet fully cataloged. She'd read them and forgotten them. In the way you forgot things that weren't relevant to your life. Her life was soil samples and humidity logs, and the specific anxiety of whether the phosphorus levels in bed 9 were trending wrong. The lid of crate 7 burst open. It came out fast, impossibly fast for something with that many limbs. Something that looked as if it had been assembled from the nightmares of a creature that hadn't yet decided what shape it wanted to be. It was roughly the size of a large crab, pale as a root vegetable. Its body a compressed disc of cartilage and muscle, from which 8 articulated legs unfolded in a single ballistic motion. It hit the greenhouse floor running, the impact of its legs producing a rapid, dry, staccato clicking that echoed up into the rafters and bounced back down strange, distorted, everywhere at once. Kale swung the spade. She missed. The thing was already gone, vanishing into the bean rows with a rustling of leaves so brief and total that it was as if it had evaporated. Scout moved. The dog crossed the greenhouse floor in 6 long, silent strides, ducking low into the bean corridor, and then the corridor erupted. A thrashing of stalks and a sound like 2 hard things colliding at speed, and then nothing. Silence. Kale stood in the amber light with her spade and her heartbeat and nothing else. She waited. Scout, her voice came out smaller than she intended. Scout here. Nothing. She moved toward the bean rows. The plants were disturbed. Several stalks bent or broken, broad leaves torn. The soil in the bed showed the scoring of something that had scrambled fast, and then changed direction. She followed the trail with her eyes, tracing the broken pattern of leaves, and found Scout in the middle of the row, standing perfectly still, her amber opticals sweeping the darkness ahead. Kale crouched beside the dog and put one hand on her flank. The synthetic's body was warm. A design choice, she'd always assumed, meant to make the animal feel more natural to humans. Warmth is a lie of companionship. She'd always thought that was a little sad. Good girl, she said quietly. The dog's sensors swept left, then right, then Scout lunged forward. What followed was not a fight in any conventional sense. It was a reckoning with the specific horror of something you cannot see trying very hard to get into your body. Kale heard Scout crashing through the next row of plants, heard the clicking of the creature's limbs, and something that might have been the dog's growl. A low mechanical resonance that she'd never heard Scout produce before. And then a scream of metal or cartilage or both, and then the clicking stopped. She found them in the gap between bed 6 and bed 7. Scout was standing. The creature was on the floor, diminished, one leg severed at its base, its pale disc body dragging in a slow sideways crawl. Scout's shoulder chassis had been damaged. The dark synthetic fur was torn back along the left side to expose the alloy skeleton beneath, gleaming silver in the amber light. Acid. Kale could see where the creature's blood had eaten into the dog's chassis, pitting the metal, exposing wiring in 2 places. Scout was still moving, still tracking, but the left foreleg was responding with a half-second delay, a telling lag that told Kale the damage was real. She stepped forward and hit the creature with the spade. She hit it 3 times. The 3rd time she put her shoulders into it, the way she'd learned to drive a fence post, the way her grandfather had shown her when she was 7 years old. On a farm that no longer existed, on a planet she hadn't seen in 16 years. And the creature stopped moving. Her hands were shaking. She stood in the ruined plant beds in the amber dark with a soil-caked spade and a damaged synthetic dog and 14 crates she hadn't opened yet. And she was shaking, and she was alive. And those 2 things seemed to occupy completely different moral categories. Scout looked at her. Yeah, Kale said, I know. She went back to the intercom. Brennan was already yelling before she got it to her ear. A torrent of protocol and override violations, and your badge number is being flagged. And she waited for him to run out of breath. 1 creature down, she said. Biohazard confirmed. I need a full hazmat response, and I need someone to catalog the other 13 crates before I open them. A long silence. 13 other. 14 crates total, Brennan. I've accounted for 1. I don't know what's in the other 13. She could hear him swallowing. Morrow, do not open those crates. I wasn't planning to, but she was looking at them. All 14 in their row, the other 13 still latched, still sealed, the rusted lids catching the amber light. And she was thinking about the sound she'd heard before the first one opened. That quiet, paper-folding sound of something testing the limits of its container. She pressed her ear against her own chest for a moment, felt her heartbeat, confirmed it was still there, and pulled the earpiece out again, because one of the other crates was moving. Not crate 2, not the one next to 7. The third one from the end near the south wall, where the experimental cultivars grew in their tall, dense rows, and the emergency light barely reached. Crate 11. It was rocking, gently, rhythmically, an almost peaceful motion that she might have called cradling, if the thing doing it were anything other than what it was. Kale walked toward it. She did not run. She thought about running. There was a solid case for running. The external airlocks were sealed, but the internal access corridor was still passable. She could breach the greenhouse through the maintenance hatch. She could leave the crates, leave the plants, leave Scout, leave everything. And let the hazmat team deal with it in the morning in their suits, with their proper equipment and their protocols that were designed by people who assumed that when a situation developed you had time to call for backup before it got worse. She walked toward crate 11 instead. This was the thing about humans that the briefings never quite captured. Not because the briefing writers were stupid, most of them were very smart, but because they were writing about scenarios. And scenarios are composed after the fact by people who weren't there. The person who was there, who was standing in the amber dark with a spade and a synthetic dog and 13 unopened crates, was not operating in a scenario. She was operating in the narrow specificity of her own particular life, with its particular history, its particular stubbornness, its particular knowledge, that if she left those crates and the hazmat team arrived in 6 hours to find 13 things loose in the greenhouse and nowhere to put them, then the food supply for 1,400 people in the outer sectors would be compromised for a growing cycle that nobody could afford. You stayed because of the beans. You stayed because of the 1,400 people who ate the beans. You stayed because of your grandfather who grew beans in the dark Iowan soil and told you that the difference between farming and every other kind of work is that in farming you don't get to leave the field just because something goes wrong. The field was the field. You were in it. She drove the spade into the lid latch of crate 11 and broke it open before the thing inside could do it itself. The creature came out slower than the first, stunned, perhaps, or hindered by the forced entry, or simply a different individual of whatever species this was, operating at its own particular tempo. It hit the floor and crouched, limbs splayed, pale body contracting and expanding in a rhythm that she recognized, with a cold clarity, as the organism assessing its environment. The amber light caught the fine texture of its surface. Not quite chitinous, not quite membranous, something in between, something that looked unfinished, like a prototype. It found her. The moment it found her was visible. The creature's entire body reoriented. Not toward her face or her hands or her spade, but toward her chest, toward the heat and rhythm of the thing inside her chest, and she understood in the same instant, without needing it explained, what the creature was looking for. What it always looked for, a host. The warmth of a system that worked, a body with the infrastructure to do what the creature needed done. It wanted to use her. She felt something harden in her jaw. Scout moved from her left side in a single fluid arc, hitting the creature mid-body and driving it into the gap between crates 9 and 10. The synthetic's movements were asymmetrical now. The damaged left foreleg compensating, the chassis tilting slightly, the amber opticals flickering once as the acid-damaged circuitry processed the correction. But she was still fast, still precise, still focused on the thing she was built for. Kale followed, spade raised. What happened next took 30 seconds and felt like 30 minutes, and she would remember it for the rest of her life. With the specific granularity that the body reserves for moments when it has genuinely not known whether it would continue. Scout had the creature pinned, not by weight but by leverage. The dog's jaws locked on one of the limb joints in a grip that held the thing from maneuvering while it thrashed and clicked and produced a thin, high-frequency vibration that resonated in Kale's back teeth. The creature's tail. She hadn't noticed the tail before. A flat, muscular appendage that the first one had apparently not deployed, whipped against Scout's left side, and the dog's chassis absorbed the impact with a sound like a cracked bell. The acid contact this time was worse. Kale saw the synthetic chassis fail on the left side, the alloy opening, the internal structure visible, the amber opticals dimming not all the way but to half power, a warm glow that in any other context would have been almost comforting. Scout's grip held, the creature struggled. Kale hit it with the spade, 1, 2, 4 times, and on the fourth strike it stopped struggling and Scout released it and stepped back. The dog was listing badly to the left. The chassis damage extended from the shoulder to the midsection now, and Kale could see clearly the internal architecture, the motors, the carbon fiber tendons, the power cells, the absence of anything soft. No blood, no meat. Just the engineering of something built to simulate life, well enough to make you forget it was simulation. She reached out and put her hand on Scout's head. The dog looked at her. The amber opticals at half power, dimmer than she'd ever seen them, still focused, still there. "You're all right," Kale said. "You're all right." It wasn't true. She knew it wasn't true. The Scout she'd spent 6 months learning to ignore, whose habit of dropping objects at her feet she'd learned to step around, whose tendency to rest her head on Kale's knee during the slow hours she'd learned to accept as background sensation. That Scout was already somewhere in the past. What was standing in front of her now was a machine with diminishing reserves and a job it had not finished. Scout looked at the remaining crates. "No," Kale said. The dog took a step toward them. "Scout, no." She stepped around the animal, positioning herself between the dog and the crates. "You're done. You've done enough." The dog stopped. The opticals tracked her face. "I'm going to need your help to get the readings," she said. "Biosensor suite. You can do that much. Tell me which ones are active." The dog stood still for 3 seconds. Then the sensor array along her muzzle activated. Kale could see the micro-movements of the secondary lenses, the slight adjustment of the emission ports. And Scout turned slowly, methodically, scanning each crate in sequence. Kale watched the dog's posture, alert for any shift in orientation, any sign that a particular container rated the kind of attention that Crate 7 had received. Scout passed crates 1 through 6 without reaction, paused at 8, moved on, paused at 12 and 13 simultaneously, holding between them, the damaged chassis trembling with the effort of maintaining position. 12 and 13, Kale said quietly. She walked to the intercom a second time. Brennan picked up before she could speak. "Hazmat is 12 minutes out," he said. His voice had changed, quieter. The bureaucratic exasperation was gone, and what was left was the voice of a man who had read his own briefings, and was now engaged in the deeply unpleasant business of believing them. "Morrow, don't touch anything else." 2 more active crates, she said. 12 and 13. "I'll need bolt restraints and sealing foam on the lids when your team arrives. Don't let them open anything without a full scanner sweep first. I know the protocol, Morrow." "I know you know the protocol, Brennan." She paused, looked across the damaged greenhouse, the broken plants, the amber light, the dog standing in the middle of it all with her ruined chassis and her half-powered eyes. "I also know the protocol doesn't cover what to do when the specimen gets out before the hazmat team arrives. Somebody should update that." She heard him breathing. 12 minutes, he said. She put the earpiece in her pocket. The next 12 minutes were the longest minutes of her life, which was saying something, because she had lived 3 years of night shifts in a greenhouse, and she had believed for most of that time that she already knew what long felt like. She stood with her back against the north wall, between the active crates and the greenhouse entrance, her spade in both hands, and Scout sat beside her, not leaning, not resting, just present, the amber opticals doing their slow sweep, the biosensor array running continuous passes in a pattern that Kale had come to read as vigilance. She thought about her grandfather, not in a sentimental way. Not the way you think about people you've lost in the soft, gauzy register of grief. She thought about him practically, the way he'd moved through a difficult situation, the way he'd oriented to a problem not as a crisis to escape, but as a thing to stand inside of until it resolved. He'd had a phrase. She hadn't thought about it in years, hadn't known it was still in her until this moment, that went, "You don't leave a field until the field is done with you." Crate 12 shifted. She tightened her grip on the spade. It shifted again, more purposefully this time, and then the lid began to rise. Not the explosive burst of Crate 7, but a slow, almost theatrical elevation, the creature inside taking its time, and she thought, with a clarity that surprised her, that if it had taken its time in Crate 7, she might have missed it entirely, might have clocked out and gone home, and the thing would have been loose in the greenhouse by morning with no one to know. "All right," she said. "Come on then." It came on. The next 20 minutes were brutal in a way that Kale did not have adequate language for, and would spend years afterward failing to describe adequately to the people who asked. Two creatures loose simultaneously, because Crate 13 opened 2 minutes after 12 regardless of what she did, and what she did was everything she knew how to do. She used the spade. She used the rows of plants as channels, herding rather than pursuing, forcing the creatures into geometries where Scout could intercept. She broke 2 more of her tomato stakes and used them as secondary tools, as distractions, throwing them across the greenhouse to trigger motion responses that bought her seconds. She climbed the grow light rigging once. Not heroically, not with any particular grace, simply because the creature from Crate 12 had oriented on her, and the rigging was there, and getting above a thing that was searching for a warm body seemed like a reasonable use of the structural options available. She fell off the rigging at some point. She didn't count it. Scout took damage twice more. The second time was bad enough that KL stopped, in the middle of everything, and looked at the dog and made herself look clearly, without flinching, at what she was seeing. Scout's chassis was opened on 3 sides now. The left foreleg had stopped functioning, and the dog was moving on 3 limbs, compensating with the geometry of her body, maintaining the operational profile of a security sentinel on fewer and fewer resources. The amber opticals were at quarter power now, not off, not failing, just reduced, the glow there but dim like a pilot light. Something essential, still burning, still there. She was still tracking, still moving, still doing the thing she was built for. Kale drove the last creature into the corner behind bed 14, with a tactic that was not in any protocol she'd ever read. She flooded the irrigation system for that section manually, 3 times the normal volume, turning the soil in bed 14 into a dense mud that impeded the creature's leg joints without affecting her boots, and when it slowed she was on it. And she did not stop until it stopped. The greenhouse was quiet. The amber light pulsed twice. A system warning she didn't recognize, which turned out to be the hazmat team's external entry signal. She could hear them at the airlock. She looked at Scout. The dog was 4 meters away, sitting in the mud of bed 14, the ruined chassis leaking something clear and viscous that Kale chose not to examine. The 3 functional legs were squared under the body in a posture that she recognized, after 6 months, as the dog's version of composure. The amber opticals were still running, still sweeping, finding nothing left to protect against. Kale walked to her. She crouched down in the mud and she put both hands on the dog's face, the soft synthetic fur that wasn't fur, the warm chassis that wasn't warm, the amber lights that weren't eyes, and she held the dog's face in her hands the way you hold something you aren't ready to let go of. Dev says I shouldn't have named you, she said. Her voice was even. Dev's an idiot. The dog's opticals were very dim now, not off, just low, like something trying to stay. You're the best dog I've ever known, Kale said. Real or otherwise. She wasn't sure if Scout heard that. She wasn't sure what hearing meant for a thing that was built rather than born. But she said it anyway. Because the words were true, and true things should be said while there was still time to say them. Her grandfather had believed that. She believed it now, in the mud of a ruined greenhouse on a planet she'd never meant to stay on. With her hands full of a machine that had kept her alive out of nothing more complicated than the persistence of its own purpose. The opticals went out. She stayed crouched there for a moment after. Just a moment. Then she stood, picked up the spade, and walked to the airlock to let the hazmat team in. Reyes was the team lead, compact, efficient, the kind of professional competence that had all its emotions neatly filed somewhere out of reach. She swept the greenhouse with her scanner before she'd taken 2 steps inside, cataloging damage, biocontaminants, activity signatures, and she slowed when she passed Scout's position and ran the scanner over the dog a second time, then a third. This is your security synthetic, she asked. Her name was Scout, Kale said. Reyes looked at her scanner. She took down 3 seismosemens. That's botanist, that's significant. These things have a chitin density that resists. She paused. What did you use? The spade, Kale said. And the irrigation system on bed 14. And the grow light rigging, which I don't recommend. Reyes looked at the rigging. She looked at the mud of bed 14. She looked at the 3 covered shapes that her team was already working around, cataloging, sealing. Then she looked at Kale. The other 11 crates were clean, she said, standard soil samples. The 3 active ones, we think they were a biological survey shipment from Sector Dusk that got cross-contaminated at the distribution hub. Nobody flagged it, the manifest was wrong. This wasn't supposed to be here. I know, Kale said. You initiated containment before we could authorize it. I know. Reyes looked at her for a long moment. She had the expression of someone recalculating something in real time, updating a model that had just received new data. The formal complaint about the unauthorized protocol initiation, she said, is going to get very interesting reading in context. Probably, Kale said. She was looking at the bean plants. Most of bed 6 was destroyed, and 5 was damaged, and the experimental cultivars along the south wall would need a full assessment before she knew what was recoverable. But beds 1 through 4 were intact. 7 through 11 were intact. The soy columns were untouched. You lost some, you saved the rest. You stood in the field until the field was done with you. And then you took your losses and counted what was left. She'd need to replace the irrigation system for bed 14. She'd need new tomato stakes. She'd broken 4 and couldn't remember when. The grow light rigging on the north side would need a structural assessment. The phosphorus levels in bed 9 were probably still wrong. And that problem hadn't gone anywhere while the other problem was happening. She had a lot of work to do. Reyes was still watching her. The hazmat team was moving around the greenhouse in their measured, careful way, and the amber emergency light was still pulsing. And outside the sealed airlocks was a planet that had been colonized in the vague hope that something would grow here and feed people. And inside the airlocks was a botanist with mud on her boots and a broken spade in her hands. And about 3.5 hours left until her shift ended. What do you need? Reyes asked. Kale thought about it. Genuinely thought about it, which meant running through the actual inventory of what she needed in order of operational priority, which was something she was good at. Something she had learned to be good at in 3 years of solving problems alone in the amber-lit dark. Replacement biosensor animal, she said. Same spec as the 7G if you have it. She knew the greenhouse. Reyes made a note. New tomato stakes, 14. And someone from structural to look at the north rigging. She paused. And the manifest for those crates, full origin chain. Whoever stamped that distribution order wrong is going to have a very difficult conversation with me. Reyes was quiet for a moment. Then she said, in the tone of someone who has just revised their opinion of a person significantly upward, I'll see what I can do. She walked back toward the entrance, her team organizing around her, and Kale stood alone in the middle of the greenhouse with the amber light and the damaged plants and the shape of Scout in bed 14, still and dark, and she thought about the difference between the things that were finished and the things that weren't. Scout was finished, the creatures were finished. The night, probably, was finished. The eastern horizon would be lightening in 3 hours, and the day shift would arrive, and there would be forms to fill, and assessments to write, and 1,400 people's worth of food production to get back on schedule. All of that was coming. But for now she walked to the south wall where the experimental cultivars grew in their tall, dense rows, and she checked them by hand, leaf by leaf, stem by stem. Because that was the work, and the work didn't stop. And because her hands needed something real to do while the rest of her caught up to what had happened. She found a patch of fungal rot she'd missed on the previous sweep. She cut it out. She checked the moisture sensors on the adjacent beds and found one reading slightly high and corrected it. She moved through the rows with the specific, unhurried competence of someone who knew exactly what they were doing and why it mattered and had decided. Some time ago, and probably without being fully conscious of deciding, that this was the kind of work worth doing. Outside on the surface of the planet, the night was ending. The eastern sky would be going from black to gray to the particular shade of deep amber that this planet's sunrise produced. Not unlike the greenhouse's emergency lights. She'd always thought, which had seemed eerie the first time she'd noticed it, and now just seemed like the planet making its own kind of sense. She thought about sending a message home, to the sister on Kepler 4, who had a farm and 3 kids and a dog that was very much not synthetic, and a standing complaint that Kale never wrote. She'd write. She'd write tonight before she slept, and she'd tell her sister the story. Probably not all of it. Probably not the part where she fell off the rigging, definitely not the part in the mud with Scout's face in her hands. But enough of it. Enough to say, I was here, and something happened, and I stayed, and I'm still here. That was the story. That was always the story. She found another patch of rot in the south cultivar row and removed it carefully, making sure she got the root system, making sure she didn't leave anything behind that would spread. The work was the work. She was still in the field. When the hazmat team lead called from the airlock, soft, not wanting to startle, To say the clearance had come through and the external seals were releasing, Kale acknowledged it without looking up from the plants she was checking. She heard the airlock cycle. She heard the difference in air pressure as the seal broke, the slight change in the way sound traveled through the space. She heard the distant growing noise of the compound waking up, the first shift machinery, the ventilation cycling to day mode, the indifferent and continuous hum of a colony that had no idea what had happened in its greenhouse in the night. She stood up. She looked across the greenhouse. The damage, the repairs that needed doing, the surviving beds, the amber light that was already beginning to compete with the first real light coming through the roof panels as the ventilation system cleared them. 1,400 people, bean plants, tomato stakes, Scout's dark shape in the mud. She picked up the broken spade. She walked to the tool locker on the north wall and found a new one. The same model, the same worn style of handle, a replacement so like the original that she almost didn't notice the difference. She checked its weight. She hung the broken one on the spare hook, where it would wait to be disposed of in the morning inventory. Then she went back to work, not because someone told her to, not because there was a protocol for it, because the sun was coming up, and the plants needed tending, and somebody had to do it, and she was there. That was the whole of it, really. That was what the briefings never managed to say, because the people who wrote them were writing about what happened, and not about the specific texture of standing inside what happened. The way it felt to be the kind of organism that stayed when staying was the difficult thing, that held ground not because it had calculated the odds, but because the ground was there, and so was it, and that was apparently enough. The sun cleared the horizon. Greenhouse Ring 7 filled with morning light. Real light, the yellow-white of a G-type star, filtering through the roof panels, falling across the bean rows, and the soy columns, and the experimental cultivars, and the damaged beds, and the mud of bed 14, and the tools on their hooks, and the hands of the botanist, who had been there all night and was still there now, and the light found all of it, the way light does, indifferent to merit, arriving regardless, making visible what was there. She checked the humidity in bed 1. She adjusted the feed rate on the east grow lights. She made a note about the phosphorus in bed 9. She was still there when the day shift arrived.